It's a great pleasure to be here this evening and have another opportunity to comment on the various aspects of the bill. The opposition, for those of you who don't know, voted against the bill at second reading because we believed that it was fundamentally flawed for many of the reasons that you've already heard from the three speakers. And we have been through, I wasn't quite like the Battle of the Somme, but we have been through 3 weeks of going through the bill. It's a very big bill. It's 113 clauses and 12 schedules, which for anorak devotees of parliamentary bills is quite something. And we sat there for 3 weeks, 8 hours a day, 8 to 9 hours a week, going through the bill line by line. And one of the things that was very depressing, and it's been alluded to by our colleagues already, is how little the government engaged with the argument. We didn't expect them that the raft of amendments that we put forward, particularly obviously on issues like student representation and a whole range of other things which I shall touch on, we didn't expect them to accept them all, and some of them were probing amendments, but there was very, very little engagement. The Minister got his head down, he had the boilerplate from the civil servants, and there really wasn't a great deal of what one might describe as iterative discussion. And this is a huge shame, because education bills don't actually come along that often. Education initiatives from government, the ministers, come along virtually every other month, and that's been part of the problem with education over the last 15 to 20 years. But this bill, which is probably the largest major bill for at least 20 years, should have been an opportunity, and perhaps even now, in some aspects, could be, to review 21st century higher education in all its diversity, because I firmly believe, in a time of massive change, that there are enormous things that we could be doing more on. We live in a world where higher education, further education, online learning and lifelong learning are converging rapidly. We live in a world where the student experience has changed and is very demanding, where the aspirations and the balance between full-time education, the traditional 3-year coursework for 18 to 22-year-olds, and the needs and the opportunities to reskill and retrain for older people to come back and enter higher education could be very, very strongly expanded and looked at with new structures. We could look at the work-study balance. We could see what could be done in the short term to mitigate, and in the long term to address fundamentally some of the issues of widening access and participation that have been alluded to already. But unfortunately, this bill is not at the moment the vehicle to do any of those things. It's not for want of trying on our part. We introduced discussion and amendments about this into the bill in the committee and in second reading discussion, and we will do likewise when it comes back into Parliament for the report stage. Now, there's been talk about Teaching Excellence Framework. Teaching Excellence Framework is a very good example of this. It should have been an opportunity to celebrate new techniques, to celebrate the commitment of teaching in our higher education institutes. During the early 2000s, mid-2000s, I sat on the Education Select Committee at the time when the then research assessment exercise was being transmuted into the Research Excellence Framework. Some of the greyer beards among you may remember that that took 6 years to be accomplished. Quite why Joe Johnson thinks that even 3 or 4 years is going to be adequate to deck out the TEF in all its glory, I do not know, but nevertheless there it is. But instead of it being those sorts of things, a challenge to raising our game in various areas, responding to students, as I say, celebrating teaching excellence, it risks, for the reasons that we've heard, becoming based on very poor metrics. It is being used as a Trojan horse for fee rises. We had TEF Mark 1, which I described as simply the equivalent of Lloyd George's coupon election in 1918, because every university got through it, and every university on that basis are now being permitted to raise tuition fees by inflation. And we now have TEF 2, which the government have made a great thing about it being a concession, that they're having another extra year, But it's TEF2, the implications of which is still not clear what eventual base of measurement it will be. But what we do know is that the coupon effect, in a slightly more refined form of pass or fail, will be allowed for a second year. And what we now know, and Brexit has been talked about already, what we now know is that the likelihood over the next couple of years, and in fact you only need to look at the latest figures from the Bank of England, I think today, is that inflation could be running at 3 or 4% by then. So, these are not simply just, academic linkages. They are linkages that are actually entirely unfair, will push more students into debt, and actually will contaminate what the teaching excellence framework should have been about. You've heard about the narrowing of some of the institutions they're talking about, and I'll talk about new advisors in a moment. And you've heard about the Office for Students. The Office for Students I described in the committee stage of the bill as Hamlet without the prince, because actually, as we've already heard, there are no direct mechanisms to put students at the heart of the various institutions of the OFS. And when you talk to the government about that in committee, they say, oh, but of course you've got to leave it up to the autonomy of the OFS, and of course I'm sure they will put students on there. But we all know in the real world that actually who's on that thing in the first place determines who comes on it afterwards. And it's extraordinary that virtually every type of university, even some of the more recalcitrant ones in the Russell Group, actually have students on their governing bodies in one shape or form and various committees. And the government seems to have this extraordinary idea that the students will just get there and will want to talk about student things, rather like sometimes people say to MPs, well, are you having a meeting for young people about young people's issues? Well, yeah, of course there are young people's issues, but it's pretty patronising to suggest that young people, students of whatever age, are simply going to be on those committees to talk about student issues. They can actually make a huge contribution, and have made huge contributions, to the governance and the organisation of the HE institutions that currently have them on their board. So everything in that bill that we have put down as amendments, and we've worked closely with our colleagues in NUS and have done so since the beginning of the year. We've had warm words but no mechanism to enable them. And of course it's not just students that need to be included in that. It's the staff. It's all the people who make up a higher education institution. Everybody from the junior lecturers, the researchers, the administrators, the teachers, yes, and the cleaners and the people like that, which is why we've also, as well as working closely with UCU, been working with Unison and other organisations. Worse still, this Office for Students is going to be have its bona fides further contaminated because the government is nervous that some of these new providers, and we'll touch on those shortly, some of these new providers won't find it easy to find a validator. And so they are proposing in the bill that the OFS should be a validator of last resort. Now, if there ever was an indication of the compromising of an institution's purpose right from the beginning, then I can't think of a clearer one. Again, we oppose that. We asked for the clause to be removed. Obviously, the government has a majority on the committee. That is opposed by every single university group, as far as I know, and even the UUK have actually been a little stronger than they usually are on some of these issues about it. We've heard about the relationship, we've heard about the UKRI. There needs to be a much closer relationship between the OFS and UKRI, not just simply for the sake of it, but it's absolutely crucial to protect taught and research degrees in the way which has been described. Again, the people you put on to these new institutions will, certainly in the beginning, influence the way those new institutions go forward. And the new guy who's running the UKRI, John Kingman, I'm sure he's been absolutely Rolls Royce of a Treasury Mandarin and everything else. But that's what his background is, and that's why he's in there to smooth. And I'm having heard him speak in the committee, the evidence sessions. Smooth is the right word for him. That's what he's there for. And of course, who's paying for this new OFS? The government has been rather coy about this, And they said they would look to higher education institutions to make a significant contribution. But when you actually looked at the detail in the technical paper, and we caught the minister napping on this in the committee stage, and he said, well, you know, it's going to be so much. And we said, actually, it's in your own paper. And what they say is, in the first 2 to 3 years, essentially, the funding will be roughly 50-50. But thereafter, the transitional funding that the government is putting in will drop back. And the actual contribution from the registration providers, which is their word for the HE institutions, will be between 70 and 75%. So actually, that's going to come out of HE institutions, and that in turn is going to impact on student fees. And that's something that hasn't very easily been picked up. We've talked about the Research Council's independence, and absolutely right to be concerned about the autonomy of the research councils in that situation. And one of the things that we have said is that that needs to have a backdrop support from the Privy Council, which it has at the moment. The new challenger institutions, I've described them as a Trojan horse. Degree awarding powers straight away. It's not going to work. Students aren't market traders. They talk about the possibility of exit being a natural part of a healthy market, and they don't easily slip a second time into the womb of the HE if they're let down by that shiny new market. And you only needed to see one of the institutions, Condé Nast College of Fashion and Design, the government brought to evidence, 10-week course, cost $6,600. We won't teach you, this is their own quote, we won't teach you to be a PR or a brand manager or a stylist in 10 weeks, but we can show you what it's like to be those things. Those are the sort of people that we are wanting to let through. I want to go on to the missed opportunities in FE colleges. FE colleges are huge importance in places like my own constituency in Blackpool in delivering higher education. Why aren't the government using them? They're not. If you look at the statistics, they say the number of HE courses being delivered will be exactly the same as now. And finally, I just want to touch on Brexit. Brexit is the elephant in the room. It affects our research capacity in HE. The position of the staff, we've talked about all of that. And now the government are looking at TEF Mark II, believe it or not, as the possibility of having a grading principle, the ludicrous Olympic-style bronze, silver, gold. There was an article in The Guardian about this last week, which would actually enable them to strip out another layer of students. So there we have it, some of the things that we are fighting against. I haven't got time to talk about how we're going to build those alliances. I hope that will come out in the questions. But there is a period of time over the next few months where we can significantly change this bill. We must significantly change it because we cannot have a university system in a little England post-Brexit curmudgeon's charter neglecting social cohesion and economic self-interest and depriving those students of the 21st century of the structures and the support that they need.